Hello and welcome to The Lightest Tread, the official podcast of Soul and Recork, where we speak to extraordinary and ordinary people who do ordinary and extraordinary things that are good for their bodies, good for the planet, and typify the soul of adventure. I'm your host, Paul Morn Brown, and my guest today is Teresa Martinez, Executive Director of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition. For over 30 years, Teresa has worked professionally to increase awareness, engagement, access, and stewardship of the United States' entire national trails system. Teresa is a lifelong outdoor recreationist and has worked for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the Continental Divide Trail Alliance before co-founding the Continental Divide Trail Coalition in 2012. The Continental Divide National Scenic Trail, or CDT, is one of the most significant trail systems in the world. Established by US Congress in 1978, it spans 3,100 miles, that's 5,000 kilometers, between Mexico and Canada. It traverses 5 states and connects countless communities along the spine of the Rocky Mountains. Soul is proud to support the Continental Divide Trail Coalition by sponsoring footbeds to help volunteers and employees of the CDTC do their crucial work in comfort. We also encourage listeners to offer their own support via the link in the episode description. We have no doubt that after listening to Teresa, you'll feel confident that it's money or time well spent. Lastly, listeners can get 15% off at yoursoul.com by entering the code Continental at checkout. If you enjoy this conversation, please do subscribe to The Lightest Tread wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy. Listen up, folks. It's time for The Lightest Tread. Thanks so much for joining me, Teresa.
It's nice to be here.
So the last time I spoke to you, you were heading to the happy mayhem of the outdoor retailer show floor.
It was happy mayhem. That's actually a wonderful way to put it. It was a lot smaller, than in the past, but a lot of great people were there. It was great to see people we hadn't seen in like 3 years, just because of the pandemic. And yeah, it was nice to kind of be back in that setting.
We used to be there on a yearly basis. We're not there anymore, unfortunately. But we used to be the bathroom sponsors.
Oh, right.
So people would be coming up to our booth to ask us for a bit of support to keep their feet happy throughout the rest of the events. It's a lot of steps. You wouldn't think you clock up quite as many steps as you do on the show floor.
It's so true. Well, it's funny because this show, they didn't actually have any carpet down, so we were just all walking on the concrete. Yeah. And so you could tell every time you'd come in, you'd run into somebody, if it was like at an intersection or something in one of the rows, you'd start talking to people and everybody was doing the shift. Like you couldn't set on your feet 1 foot too long. And actually, I was talking to a good colleague of mine. I don't know if you know Jason Lacunas, who puts on PCT days out at Cascade Locks, but we were kind of laughing about it. Just we were both shifting, and he says, "Oh, are you feeling it too?" And I looked at him and I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Do your feet hurt?" And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "Yeah, they really hurt." And I was wearing like tennis shoes with insoles, but it's just that concrete and you're walking up and down and all around. And I think at one point I sat down somewhere in a meeting with Osprey, and I thought, God, this is the first time I've sat down in 2 days, and really sat down. And I was like, wow, that felt good. But yeah, you can tell, a lot of times at least in a lot of these shows, they'll put like padding and carpet in the walkways, but they didn't have any of that. So you could tell everybody though was shifting. It was kind of funny.
Yeah. So it's back in Salt Lake City. Is that correct?
I think that's what, like, the winter show will be there, I guess. Yeah. I'm not sure if we'll go. We'll see who all's there. Yeah. We, CDTC works with partners like you all. And we just work with everybody so much throughout the year anyways, that, the show is just kind of a bonus to see a lot of people at once in one place. But if not everybody's there, I think we're looking at other ways. That's actually one of the things I was talking to the PCT days folks about, is like, maybe we go to events like that where we're all there and it's a little bit more social. And so we're not having to take time away from the retail component of it, but we're actually still building relationship with all of our partners and, outdoors where we're not doing the shift. or at least from walking on concrete indoors, and looking for other ways to sort of really connect with one another. Because I think at this point in our relationships, we'd like to work with partners like you all that are really invested in us as people and humans, and like we are in you. And
Mm,
the alignments are great, because we get to do great work together. But it's really meaningful then when we get to actually experience stuff together. So it's not just the show. It's just not just going to get a meal together. It's going for a hike or doing fun things together or finding ways to really show up as humans with one another, so that those relationships are really not just the transaction of you support us and we elevate your brand. It's more that we actually like each other as people, and we support each other, and we're there for each
mm,
other. So finding those opportunities to really lean into those relationships a little bit more, where we're all a little bit more present even, and we're not just like, I have to go because I got another meeting, and we're running from thing to thing to thing,
mm,
which is
mm,
what always happens at OR. You're
mm.
constantly moving. So yeah.
Yeah, that's it's definitely one of the things that we miss as a team. I mean, I only had I had two shows at OR, so I didn't have that much time to sort of build those relationships outside of our own brand. It's something that we miss as an opportunity as a team internally, also to get together. We're spread out across a couple of different locations, and there's kind of there's a bit of that what my friend Emily calls trauma bonding through just the exhausting nature of the whole experience of the setup and takedown, and not to mention the dinners and drinks in between, and
Yeah. Just and
but definitely
yeah.
the social side of the event. Also reconnecting. It was great for me as a newbie to the event to see people's faces light up when this rep that they haven't seen in ages comes in, and yeah, it's a great event. So perhaps it's a good opportunity to ask you to describe your role exactly, and give us a bit of an idea of what is it that you do at OR, for instance. What are those relationships that you're working on building, and what is the ultimate end goal?
Yeah, so I'll just start off too with the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, and that we are the lead national partner working with the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and National Park Service in the cooperative stewardship of the Continental Divide Trail. So what does that mean? It means that we work in relationship, right? Just like I was just saying, with these three federal agencies that are charged with sort of the congressional um, responsibility of oversight of the Continental Divide Trail, but they need to do that in partnership with a nonprofit partner or a private partner. That would be us. And so we sort of form this really unique cooperative relationship where we can both leverage our strengths. So the agencies obviously have agency stuff, but for example, the Park Service and the Forest Service don't come out of the same department. One is Department of Interior and one is Department of Agriculture. And so they don't always speak the same language. So we can sometimes serve as that liaison, or with local gateway communities or whatever, we serve in a liaison role with partners, organizations, individuals, hikers, um, recreationists of all sort, in terms of how the CDT affects them and they can be involved in its stewardship. And so for CDTC, we in general do everything from working with Congress to working with agencies, working with gateway communities, working with users, working with indigenous communities, working with business communities to sort of understand the importance of the Continental Divide Trail, both as a recreational resource, but also the significance of it as a national treasure, which is it's the major watershed of the North American continent. It's kind of an important resource for the entire continent, not to mention just the United States. Especially when you talk about all these things with water and fire, it's kind of a big deal. So we sort of serve as that
Mm,
public-private partner. Um, we serve in that role as the part of that public-private partnership. And so my role as executive director, I'm also one of the co-founders, is really providing that strategic vision, but also working with all of our partners to understand how we can be better of service, whether it's a gateway community, the recreationists, working with corporate partners, or working with decision makers, in all the different ways where we know our core values, finding ways we can align and expand our core values with other partners and individuals and all the different spectrums, where we can find alignment so we can continue to expand this incredible community that loves and cares about not just this trail that's on the spine of the Continental Divide, but the divide itself, this landscape that is just so fundamentally important on a larger scale than even just being able to hike it from north to south or south to north, that it just serves this incredibly important role in creating life for everybody, from little critters to big critters to communities from time immemorial to today, and in the future. So my role is really in, obviously I have oversight of the organization, but we have a team we're very flat. We have 16 employees, all of which work. We're such a small team. We're always working together. There's no hierarchy. I really just sign paychecks. Really, everybody else we're all self-directed, and we work together really close as a team, but it allows us to maximize our capacity to for all of us to kind of work individually, but also as a small team. But then also, my work is to make sure that team has all the resources and tools it needs to be effective and be innovative and creative and thrive in the roles that they all have and we all have collectively, because it's definitely a we. So my role at OR is really just, I'm there because all of you are there, or, partners are there. And it's a great opportunity to sit down and just have some FaceTime with people we really like a lot. Like I said, as we started, just, we're not in this just because we get free gear. It's like, we want to work together with partners that really wanted to work together and think about this landscape that is so important. And it doesn't stop at the US borders. It continues all the way north and south, to the ends of the earth, literally. And so thinking how we can expand and really nurture a community that loves this landscape, loves the fact that there's a trail on it that allows us to connect to this landscape, and then celebrate all of the people, the humans that are deeply connected to today and can be deeply connected to it tomorrow in a way that's really meaningful and deep, and not to oversell it, but it really is just about how do we maintain those relationships and nurture the great work that we can do, just to keep people aware that this landscape is important, it exists, it's protected, and that you can hike along this amazing spine of the continent. So that's why I'm at OR, and it's a lot of fun. It's also a lot of work. People think it must be just totally fun, and I'll be honest, like sometimes you feel like a piece of bread in a fishbowl. You're just kind of like, I'm talking too much, or you just spend all day talking. And I'm an extrovert. People don't believe this, but I'm like an extroverted introvert. So I love people, but I only love people after I've been able to hold myself up in a house with all the blinds drawn and like talk to nobody. And I can recharge and kind of have some space, and I can take a deep breath. I can like, okay, I'm good. And then I can go back out and be like dynamic and everything else, but I have to have both. And, OR, you kind of like, you're immersed in like people and conversation, and sometimes deep conversation. And, to be really present, you show up as yourself. And so it's, OR can take a lot out of you. And then oftentimes you're not eating the best food and whatever. So, cause it's it's a trade show, so you're just moving really fast. But it's great to be there on behalf of CDTC. So, because it's easy to talk about the work we do.
It definitely makes life easier if you have interesting stories to tell and good things to say, things you're excited to talk about. That's really what it comes down to, is the stuff you're talking about exciting to you as much as to anybody else. So OR is one small element in the bigger, obviously in the bigger scope of all of that you've spoken about, and there is so much going on in that. There is so much that you are doing. Let me say, to me, my first awareness, maybe it's because I grew up in South Africa and I now live in Canada. so I'm not immersed in the United States and the sort of outdoor culture there specifically. My first awareness personally of the CDT came in conversation with a couple of the through hikers who we have relationships with. One of whom is Amathan Sebaraja, who I know is on the board
Mhm.
there with you guys, and the other is Zalzan Akatsali, both of whom are fantastically inspiring people in their own ways. The points of all of this, though, being that in my mind, the CDT is predominantly a through hiking trail. Maybe not predominantly, but that's perhaps how it's most idolized or romanticized, or
Mhm.
that's the sort of glossy version of outdoor enthusiasts' idea of what is the CDT. Well, it's this really, 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 really long, really, really, really beautiful, and really, really challenging walk from Mexico to Canada. I'd love it if you could unpack a few of those other ideas, though, of how it's more than just that. And you've spoken to it in terms of conservation, and in terms of the role you play as almost a mediator between
Mm.
government agencies. I'm really interested in how does that work? What's the role exactly that you play in the conservation of the area, and what is the dynamic between the purely sort of recreational aspect of the trail, and how much does that to the give to and take from the conservation aspect of things, if that's not a hugely
I feel like,
convoluted
yeah, that's like
question.
20 questions. How much time do we have? No, I can think I can do this. We
Pick
definitely,
one,
I know.
anyone.
Well, I'll start from this idea. Yeah, right. It's like well, they're all related though. And it is, I mean, I think that's a
Sure.
beautiful thing is this is a trail where maybe unlike other trails, so much intersects because it is such an important landscape in its own right. Like in its own right, the Continental Divide has a major important role in life on this planet, in that it's where water emerges from the ground and then flows east and west, actually kind of north a little bit too, and a little south, and provides these arteries of life to communities all around the world. Ultimately, when it flows to the ocean and then it goes around. Um, we very early on in Continental Divide Trail Coalition sort of history realized that focusing on just the recreational experience really minimized the understanding of what this trail really is about. And so when national scenic trails in the United States are designated, they're designated for two purposes. One is to protect the nationally significant natural, cultural, scenic, and historic resources of that trail, and then to provide the maximum benefit, outdoor recreation benefit to the public. When you look at those things, in the case of the Continental Divide Trail, Congress, in its original study report, determining that it was suitable to create one, that it was nationally significant enough to create a national scenic trail around it, was that the goal was to provide an intimate experience with the person on the trail to the Continental Divide. And that could be whether they are stepping foot at a road sign, like when you're traveling over or under the divide and you're like, oh my God, I'm on the divide. I can pee on both sides of the watershed, or you're actually walking along in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark, or in one of the footsteps of an indigenous community, or any of those, things, following elk or whatever. So we realized that for someone to really have a meaningful, intimate experience, we probably needed to focus more on the landscape and the connections that it fostered than to focus on just the recreational experience. That was a one dimensional compared to this expansive opportunity to think about all the connections around the divide. That it is this these are lands that were ha- communities of indigenous people and native people have had connections to for time immemorial, and in many cases these people have their emergent stories coming from the divide itself. And I think that that's really important, because water comes from this as well. And that's where life evolves. We can't live without water. The cross cultural connections that it's east to west, in this westward expansion of the United States and all that stuff, both in its good and bad parts, understanding that significance historically, understanding the watershed, understanding the wildlife migrations, the human migrations in general, understanding the climate issues affecting this landscape. It has this opportunity to really provide this understanding of the connections, communities, and cultures that are along this amazing landscape in a way that maybe isn't, other trails don't maybe lean into as much. And if we do that well, we realize the recreational experience will only benefit. It will follow naturally, because once you get people to the divide, if you've told the story in the appropriate way and honored and acknowledged the appropriate individuals and people, meaning native peoples appropriately, and you can build this long-term understanding of the past, present, and future of this landscape, the landscape itself will tell the rest of it. Like, I don't need to tell you how beautiful it
Mm.
is at Gray's and Torrey's Peak, or how beautiful it is in the Boot Heel, or how beautiful it is at Glacier. Glacier speaks for itself. I don't have to do
Mm.
that. We don't have to do that. But it will also tell a different story if it's not protected, if it's developed, if it's, environmentally impacted by other kinds of things, or like what's happening in Yellowstone right now, the flooding that has just cut off communities and destroyed roads and has closed the park. I don't know if y'all are aware of this up north, but Yellowstone has had such massive flooding that they've closed the entire park because roads have washed out. The communities of Gardner and I can't remember the other town are completely cut off from the rest of the world because
Wow.
roads have been flooded. The roads, it's unprecedented flooding. Well, that tells a story also of climate change. The
Mm.
fires that are happening here in New Mexico, the immense drought that has caused the national forest to close in prevention of further fire because of
Mm.
extreme drought and weather. That tells a story that even though hikers maybe can't experience the CDT right now in New Mexico and national forests, the fact that they can't have that intimate experience is also telling a story. And I think that the way we've looked at the trail beyond just the recreational experience allows us to lead people into those spaces so they can have those experiences themselves and understand that in a very profound way. Um, I think our work is really around, I talked about relationships. It really is around relationships. And, you can't bring people to these places in a transactional sense, like just, check a box, come on a hike. That's not enough to really, engage people in that space. But they don't necessarily need to hike from Canada or Canada to Mexico to have that. There are communities and individuals and people, families, native peoples who have never hiked a foot on the Continental Divide Trail, but have an immense and deep connection to the Continental Divide landscape. And so, whether they're day
Mm.
hiking or having picnics or doing ceremony, or in fact hiking with their families and friends and neighbors, that they can connect to this landscape is just as important as someone being able to hike um, north to south for 6 months along its spine, because that connection is just as valuable. And so we focus on, well, yes, I think you're right. 99% of what people see of these long trails are these really amazing athletes who hike end to end or right end to end or do anything like that. That's just amazing. It's also just as amazing that a family that has lived along the divide for generations, you know, looks out their window and watches the sunset and has this profound, overwhelming sense that they can hike on a trail that's right in their front yard and also have that intimate experience beyond just their front window. That there is this thing that they can also steward, or it can support their business in town, or it can provide an educational experience or a health benefit or something to their community. That there's so many other ways that this landscape and this trail can impact human life that is beyond just that 6 month kind of space. And so I think we try to work at CDTC. We provide all the information to the American public, or all the public, I shouldn't say, not just American public, on the trail and how to access it, and other resources they can use to access it, whether it's through paid services like apps and everything else, or our free online map set and our planning guide that's free. To we provide volunteer services to make sure the trail is maintained and signed, to completing the trail so the actual trails off of highways, to the education and outreach stuff we're doing through Gateway Communities to elevate small business owners, voices, in particular out in the Rocky Mountain West. So many communities are small, and they're not like the AT or PCT. They're not LA. They're not Washington, D.C. or Boston. These are communities that sometimes have 10 people in them, and
Mm.
so thinking about how we can give them voice, that's just as valuable and important as anybody else in this whole thing is also some of our work. And then just protecting this landscape and elevating these stories, whether again they're around climate change or wildlife migration or human migration, or just the fact that this is where water comes from in the North American
Mm.
continent, is kind of a really cool thing. And I think our work tries to knit all of that together in a really human, personable way. We really do focus on those human relationships. And if it means our work takes longer, it takes longer. If it means our work is bigger, then it's bigger and it takes longer. And if it feels different, it is different. We work a lot in our trail. We also deal with communities of color, because the trail starts in New Mexico, at the border of New Mexico or the United States and Mexico, and at the base of New Mexico, and goes all the way to Canada. So we have this great opportunity to also talk about diversity and equity and justice, just because some of the communities we go through are communities that oftentimes aren't in the conversation, but are directly addressing those issues. And then, again, we are this large landscape that's skinny up and down the spine of the divide that also connects these communities themselves. And so we try to do this work in a way that never loses sight of those nationally significant resources as they relate to creating a recreational experience, but we focus more on those. We probably focus first, I shouldn't say more, first on those the resources, so that recreational experience is profound. Again, whether it's for a picnic or a through hike. And I think all of our work, we're focused, all of us at CDTC, I think we all like people a lot, so we all work a lot well with people. We focus on the human relationships a lot. So
I love the idea of focusing on the profoundness of the experience, um, and the timing is kind of perfect actually. And this is almost a continuation of a conversation I had with a guy called Connor Ryan a
oh.
couple of weeks ago, who's a Lakota skier.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about the way that we tell the stories of adventure, and going out into areas that are the wilderness, and how the definition of the wilderness includes the idea of a place that's never been that's untrammeled by man, quote unquote, and how that sort of ignores the native history of a place.
Absolutely.
um, and I think that's a really poignant idea. A lot of people undertaking a recreational trip into, quote unquote, the wilderness or nature, we think of having its real power in getting away from your place in human society, which it might to some extent for some people. But I really like the idea that, in fact, when you get the richest experience of, or the richest version of that experience, and the most authentic version of that experience, is when you do so in the context of your place within the broader human history, the broader human story, and how that story fits into the natural cycles and the natural history of the place. And as Connor said, not as a separate entity, not as my story is separate and I come to visit nature, but as part of, one living being, as a part of the overall broader natural history of the place, that human beings are just as much as any other animal that you might come across.
Yeah, I think this is a really important message around, not that we're going to go there, but equity and justice and diversity, and that there's this notion that man is separate, and the reality is we're human, right? We human,
Mm.
like there's two parts of us, like, and when we think about the divide, I've been, this is something I've been sort of, um, I call it vamping on for a little while, really thinking about it. But this idea of emergence, and if you think about water being life and life being water, something like the Continental Divide where water begins. And there are places on the Continental Divide Trail where you literally stand where the Missouri River starts, or the Gila River starts, the Colorado River starts, the Rio Grande River starts, these major arteries of life that fuel not just, life, but economies and, everything. And of course, we're seeing them, all these water ecosystems struggle, right? A lot of these water systems no longer reach the ocean. The Colorado and the Rio Grande no longer reach the ocean. But if they're a point of emergence, you think about every piece of water that flows out from the ground through one of these major or minor arteries into the oceans. Eventually, they make their way all around the planet and come back as rain back to the divide in a point of convergence. So they're both this point where we leave and we come home to. And if you think about it in that context, we're all connected. It's almost impossible that at some point every molecule of water hasn't touched us in some way, in some form. I'm thinking big here. Obviously, I'm very philosophical in this space, but I think when you think about it in that context, we are all related and we are all connected because water just flows through us. We can't exist. And then if you think about, like, this is another thing I've been thinking about in general, which has nothing to do with the CDT, but maybe a little bit, because we're watching, so much drought and history of water resources being really, struggling right now. Ecosystems are struggling because of lack of water, or these really extreme water events. But in so many ways, there are parts here, in particular in New Mexico, where if you think about it in a human scale, are dehydrated. When humans are dehydrated, we run into all sort of physical issues and potential death. And you look at the planet as a whole, or this particular ecosystem, and while yes, we're a point of emergence and convergence, we're also significantly dehydrated right now. So we're really at this precipice of understanding, like, the importance or being able to take action to maintain health, not just of our ability to have this intimate experience, the divide, and survive it, but that there's still a divide to connect to. I think for me, that notion of where we are in the delicate balance of life is really profound and important for our generation right now. And as a conservationist, as a trail manager, as a steward, as somebody who's thinking of this, that goes back to this idea that we are not separate, but we are a part of this system. But yeah, maybe we're one part of the system that's had a larger influence than maybe others. But we also have an opportunity to have a greater influence to go the other direction as much as we have sort of taken. Now it's maybe time to give back. But in that larger context, you can't separate us from this landscape. It's a part of us in all the ways. And for me, I think when I think about the work we do on the divide, I mean, some people are like, it's just a trail. And you're right, it is. But it's a trail that connects us to this amazing place that's part of the reason it exists. It isn't just for the recreational component. It's to have this intimate experience and understanding of this landscape, of national significance. And it doesn't end at the borders. Those are artificial. Like this landscape continues beyond our borders, and the potential to connect to so many bigger ideas and thoughts because of that and places is just overwhelming at times, but also then it makes you really appreciate you can still have impact locally, and that, because we're all in this connected space, at some point that will connect others and affect others. But yeah, it's I think this idea of we are a part of the process. It's not a transactional thing. It's very relational. We relate to this because it's part of who we are. Our DNA comes from it. Our DNA is affected by it fundamentally. So we should be a part of it. And I think the more that people like Connor talk about that and others talk about that, hopefully we can sort of see a shift in how we all treat our experiences in those places that we are a part of, not separate of or from wild places.
For sure.
So anyway, I went down some rabbit holes.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love the rabbit holes. And please don't apologize. I love the rabbit holes. I pushed you down the rabbit hole. I'm interested in the function of the trail itself.
Mm,
like the actual physical trail in this whole broader conversation. Because one thing that I found interesting, um, doing a bit of reading, which hadn't it's kind of obvious when you think about it, but it hadn't occurred to me before, was the idea that the trail needs to exist partly in order to concentrate traffic, human
mm,
traffic, along a sort of monitored or maintained, but more importantly, contained path. And in you would think initial impression is, well, hang on, if everybody's in one place, surely that's more harmful than to have everybody spread out. But then you realize, well, no, if everybody's walking one trail, it minimizes the amount of impacts that's caused throughout, rather 100 people and walk one trail than 100 small damages in a sort of broad surrounds. Um, so it's almost similarly to how the riverbed is the journey of the water molecules. The trail itself gives this sort of passageway for people to travel it and to experience it. Um, and so it does hold a very specific, plays a specific function, and it holds a
mhm.
specific importance in and of itself. um, so I would like to speak to the trail itself, at least briefly, and talk about the ins and outs of, I mean, uh, me, I personally am completely ignorant to how it all works. How do you maintain a trail from from Mexico to Canada? Like, how physically, who's responsible for all of it, and how much do you do, and how much is up to government organizations?
Yeah, so well, I'll start first with maybe the origin of the Continental Divide Trail. So when Congress created the CDT, they were also, aside from saying we want people to have an intimate experience with the divide, they also mentioned that they want that experience to remain relatively primitive, so that experience really is as truly possible, as much as possible, unencumbered from facility. So unlike the Appalachian Trail, there would be no shelters or privies, and when you're anybody who's done any long distance hiking on the CDT knows that community access is minimal, just because of the small rural communities that exist. Um, and Congress was really specific around things like signing, saying that the use the primitive tool necessary. So if you're in a place like the desert, the Boot Heel of New Mexico, instead of having where there are no trees, first of all, and there's sand, so you can't really build a trail through that kind of environment. It can get beaten in, but it can't necessarily be built unless you do really heavy construction and put in all this other stuff, in which again Congress said not to do. Then it's going to be line of sight. So is there a way, encouraging development of a trail to be minimal, so that even as you're hiking, there's a little bit of that kind of connection to the unknown and the unexpected and the adventure,
Hmm.
right? So unlike the AT where there's a blaze every other tree and people still get lost, um, on the CDT you might not see a sign. By design, you might not see a sign for a quarter mile or a mile, because
Hmm.
really we're only supposed to sign at road crossings and major intersections.
Wow.
And in places where you can see, like up high, up in the high country or in the desert, it's line of sight. So you'll see a sign way off in the distance or a rock. And also, they gave us everything from using rock cairns to wooden posts to actually the reassurance, we call them reassurance signs, but the little blue markers that are metal, to in wilderness having branded trees or routed signs on natural wood, signs that are then put on trees. But the signing is minimal. It's not a white blaze on a tree. It can be a rock cairn. And so the goal was to keep people in that space of what a truly having a truly authentic experience on the Continental Divide, which is, it is wild. It's not necessarily wilderness, but it is
Hmm.
wild. And so it isn't intended to be so defined that, like a traditional trail is constructed from end to end. Well, that will never probably happen on the CDT, or at least maybe someday it would, when there's that much use that we need to do that for resource damage. But that would be the trigger. It'd be resource damage versus just outwardly from the beginning. So like the Appalachian Trail, the environments that it goes through are predominantly mountains that have no pathways. So they have to heavily construct by pulling a lot of dirt off the ground. It's really invasive to create something that looks like a deer created it. And having built trail for my entire career from start to finish, trail construction is it's like a little mini road without the, heavy equipment, but you're moving sometimes in side slopes that are really steep, a lot of dirt, moving trees, moving vegetation, moving animals, moving critters, because the little critters that live in the ground. So it's not it's a very invasive process. And I think and sometimes you have to do that because that's what the resource demands. But in other cases where the resource, like for example, if you're at the top of the long ridge and it's literally 10 feet wide and you can't go in either direction because you're on the physical divide, I don't know where else you're going to go, but that 10-foot wide ridge, you could put a cairn mile away and be okay because you're not going to get lost. Well, I can't say that. You shouldn't get lost. Maybe I don't know. Anyway, we won't even go there. We won't pass that judgment. But because I'm sure somebody, I worked at the Appalachian Trail for 20 years, and my region was Southwest and Central Virginia, and to me the AT was so oversigned. I don't know how people got lost, but they did all the time, and it was right around when cell phones were becoming popular. And I'll never forget, I got this phone call from somebody and they're like, I'm lost. And I'm like, okay, what do you want me to do about it? Like, and they just happened to call the office and I happened to be in that day. And because I wasn't in the field, usually we were in the field because we spent so much time out in the woods. And they were like, I was like, well, where did you start? Here, XYZ place. Okay, well, and I happen to know this trail section really, really well, like the back of my hand. And I was like, well, what are you on? Well, it looks like a trail. I'm pretty sure you're on the AT. Well, I haven't seen a sign. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure you're on the AT because if you're on what you're describing to me, there's a path that it looks like this, XYZ. There's no other place to go but the AT in this location. And they didn't believe me. And so I said, I'll tell you what, if you have service, because this is right when cell phones were kind of new in the backcountry, they walked with their phone talking to me. And sure enough, like 100 yards later, they finally found a tree. They turned around and saw a tree that had a blaze on it, like right where they were standing. But because they were only looking in one direction, they didn't. And they're like, oh, I guess I am not lost. And I'm like, no, you're not lost. But so I will say that I'm always amazed, which is also a beautiful thing, that people push themselves out in places maybe they're not ready for, but it's all great. I think on the case of the CDT, I would say that from our design standards, we have, policy and guidance that tells us what we can and cannot do to ensure a good experience, that intimate experience of the divide, which is not a place where it's oversigned and it's very, like, I would call it, it's not a county park, but it isn't necessarily a dangerous place where you're going to, you shouldn't feel like, notoriously the CDT has been a place where, gosh, until 2018, it wasn't even officially signed from end to end. We did that in a partnership with the Forest Service. So, and even there now, it's only 4 years later, some of the signs I'm sure are gone. So, the ongoing process of investing in the signing alone, and just generally maintenance is heavy, and the agencies can't do it by themselves. So we definitely are in a shared stewardship partnership. We have volunteer projects we run. We work with gateway communities to have adopt a trail programs. There are a lot of partner organizations and Youth Corps that do some of that lift as well. And then some places don't have anybody yet. So there's still, there's places that are in constant need of support, and other places that, when you're above tree line in Colorado, there's not much work you need to do. There's no clipping and snipping. It might be some care and fixing here and there, but there's really minimal work to be done. But it's all an investment, and we try to go by the guidelines that were set kind of by policy by the Forest Service, interpreting this direction from Congress, which is to be minimally signed, minimize facilities, unless it's resource damage, to really minimize even construction so that it's passable by equestrian and hiking foot traffic. So I should also mention that the CDT is primarily for hikers and equestrians and pack stock, but there are a lot of other uses that are allowed case by case along the entire CDT, which includes mountain bikes. In some places, there's even motorized trail use and motorized use in general, which we're moving some of those motorized sections to non-motorized sections eventually. But there's a whole host of conditions. And so starting this year, actually, we're starting to document all of that condition of the CDT so we can start building long-term maintenance plans for the trail, which don't exist right now. Because unlike the AT and PCT, while the trail is 45 years old, it really hasn't been until the last 10 years that people even had maps of the CDT, like official maps of the CDT. So, we're kind of where ATC and the Pacific Crest Trail Association were maybe in the 80s. So we are just beginning that journey of documenting the conditions and everything that's on the trail to understand what does it take to actually sustain and maintain these places and what kind of resources and stuff do we need. And we're doing that in partnership with federal agencies. But because the federal agencies themselves have capacity issues, we're taking a lot of that we're doing the heavy lift and utilizing their skills and making sure that everything jives with what they have. But it's not necessarily, we really serve in that capacity to get it done because we're so much more nimble and flexible than a federal agency is. And then continue to recruit volunteers and organizations and partners and everybody else to adopt trail segments and work in stewardship on those places. But I wish I could say it was a really fine oiled machine, but I would say instead we've got all the parts of the machine in the garage and we're learning how to put them all together. And we don't have necessarily some plans, but we've kind of done it before, so we're going to wing it. I think, I used to tell people, it's like we're in the kitchen, we're baking a cake, and we've had one explosion so far. That was a previous organization that existed. Now we're back in the kitchen. It's working out so far. I think we're going to be okay with this cake, but then we're going to have to ice it and hope that it doesn't go bad there. But, yeah. So we know what parts work. So we're starting to pull those parts together.
In order to do that, it must come down to extensive personal experience. Money. Yeah, money. I was gonna. That was my next question. How does it work? So the CDTC has been around for 10 years now, correct?
10 years officially. 10 years. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, we're a private nonprofit. So we've grown a lot, and a lot of our funding, we only get like maybe 15% of our funding from the federal government. Everything else is corporations, mostly private individual giving, grants, that kind of stuff for on the ground trail work. We do a lot of grants with organizations that fund trail work, that kind of stuff, state organizations, you name it. But our biggest source is really, we built CDTC on the idea that everybody who gave $1 was as important as one person who gave $100. That we'd actually prefer 100 people giving $1 than one person giving $100, solely because then we had 100 voices who were willing to speak up on behalf of the CDT versus just one voice who could go away at any given time. So we value immensely being very grassroots based. So pretty much, I think over half, 55 to 60% of our funding comes from individual donations. So individuals, memberships, giving, you name it. And I'm really proud of that because that means to me that over 2,800, 3,000 people, we have those voices in support of this landscape and in this trail versus just one person who was like, hey, here's a check for whatever, which we love. I'm not complaining, but I'm also saying that it's important to have a lot of different ways you get funding in. And I think it allows us with this strong grassroots support to really stay focused on the ground versus being directed by, like, when you chase money. This has been my experience, 35 years in nonprofits. Money is power, which is seductive, But oftentimes when you have one person kind of dangling a lot of money in front of you, you end up shifting mission to follow the money versus staying true to your roots. And I think by us really focusing on our grassroots foundation, we stay as close as possible to the trail and the communities we serve as we can and as we want to, which is we are always in service of the people who love this landscape and this trail first. And if people want to come in and say, I believe in that mission and I want to support that with no strings attached, we're like, yes, join the many. And I think, and then of course, federal agencies who have a duty to support some of this work as well, because it is a federal, it's a congressionally designated trail. But I think in terms of money is important, obviously, because especially long-term sustained funding, and this is an issue I have currently where you see all this funding going out there for like America the Beautiful, but it's this one-time injection of funding versus long-term sustained funding, which I would rather, again, that's why grassroots funding is so important. If you're doing your job well, people will support you and they will continue to support you. And if you don't do your job well, they won't support you. So that's, we're not in competition with anybody but ourselves, so to speak, because we should be of service to the people that are investing in us. We should be good stewards of those funds so that we're doing what we need to be doing on behalf of the trail and the communities we serve. Having said that, people themselves are important, that people are willing to stand up and speak out on behalf of protecting the trail and stewardship of the trail and stewardship of the communities along the trail and stewardship of trails in their own backyard, whether they're the CDT or connect to the CDT or not, because trails are so important to us as a society for human health, physical health, mental health, economic health, general well-being. Trails themselves serve so many values to communities that having trails is fundamental, should be fundamental, at least in the United States, if not everywhere else, fundamental to the fabric of society. So having people who are willing to speak up and stand up on behalf of trails, especially the CDT, is so critical, because it also demonstrates it's not just me, it's a we, and that we is powerful and we have a voice, and we're going to take care of this regardless of if we have funding or not, and I think that-that's what people miss. CDTC is not an empire builder. While yes, we've grown a lot in the last 10 years from the four of us who started CDTC with $4 to where we have over $1 million budget this year. I'm really proud of that because, again, over half of that is from individual donations. We don't have fancy offices. We all mostly work from home. We do have an office in Golden, Colorado, which gives us a central place to mail, cool stuff out from and have a place that people can send letters to and call. But we really try to minimize the overhead so that really the funding that we get and the support that we receive stays again to the people in the landscapes we serve primarily first. But that isn't to say, folks at CDTC, we want to make sure folks at CDTC who work here also can stay here for a long time and thrive as employees and professionals and people who love what we get to do in service of the trail. But none of us are getting rich. I will just say that too for you. None of us are. We could definitely do better in that arena. But I would also say that, it is important for us to make sure the trail has the resources it needs, whether it's being able to provide free map resources to the public, which is really critical to us, or planning guides and other kinds of things, to be real generous so that people really can feel a connection to the trail is important. All of our volunteer projects are free. All of our events are free, family friendly, open to the public, and inclusive, welcoming, so that people can be a part of this stuff, regardless of if they look like somebody in a backpacker magazine. That they are still welcome. If they haven't hiked the entire CDT, that the CDT is still something for them, and they belong, and that they have just as important connection as people who've hiked it from end to end. And I think that's a big stereotype that we've spent a lot of time breaking down, because then again, those people are then the voices who stand up and speak out on behalf of these trails and hopefully support us. But more importantly, just stand up and speak out and fight for these places that, are so nationally significant and important to us for all the reasons, not just for the recreational ones, but, in our case, that it's where the watershed begins. So it's worth speaking up for. But yeah, I think it's it's a crazy system. It's, it's hard to distill into like a 10-minute answer, which was way too long too. But, but it's complicated.
For sure, it's complicated, but I'd say it's a you could just we could just transcribe your 10-minute answer and give it off, in my opinion, as a political handbook to any hopeful politicians for how to run a community, or
Right?
how to a sort of value guideline for how to take care of a place in a group of people, for sure.
I was gonna say, I was gonna relate that back to the conversation around what I was doing at OR. I think we've been very selective of who we work with, even
Hmm.
because we want organizations and partners, and whether they're corporate or foundations or other organizations, to reflect those same
Hmm.
values,
Hmm.
right? That we're really in this together, and and everybody gives what they can,
Hmm.
right? Whether that's $1 or a backpack or $1,000,
Hmm.
that's all important. It's the whole mix. Like there's no one that's more important than the other.
Hmm.
And that also, again, when I was talking about the relationships, that these are mutually beneficial relationships because we're furthering collective and co-aligned values
Hmm.
around being human
Hmm.
and relational and being able to ebb and flow and adapt and be flexible, because not every day is it perfect. And I think that's what happens so often. You see in other places, you see a very corporate mentality. And even internally, we're not I think we have incredible overachievers on our team. And so we work really hard. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves, like, it's okay if we don't get it
Hmm.
all done.
Hmm.
It's okay, because we'd rather do 6 things really well than our overly ambitious 10 things we thought we could do. Because let's make sure we're not ruining relationships or the quality of our work in accomplishment of widgets that aren't really meaningful.
Hmm.
That let's define success on the depth and health of the relationships that allow us to get those 6 things done, versus over promising or over you know or skimping on delivery of services
Hmm.
just to be able to tick things off on the
Hmm.
list. And I think that's hard for us. Not hard for us, it's easy for us, but it's hard in this society to remember it's not about, we define success differently.
Hmm.
Like if you and I ran into each other on the street after this conversation, and I was like, how are you doing? And you're like, oh, I'm doing pretty good, but I hadn't talked to you between then, and I didn't know like major things had happened in your life. I'd feel like, what, I really felt I dropped the ball. Like, stop. Let's tell me more. I'm going to switch, I'm going to tune out these things, and let's be present in this moment, and let's talk about
Hmm.
you.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And I think we don't do that enough in our world. And so we move to this transactional space. And I think that's true in nonprofits as it is in for profits. And when it comes to this work that we do along the CDT, that's when we get into trouble,
Hmm.
is when we lose sight of the things that are really important. And so that's whether it's, again, 100 people giving $1 is so important to me, because that's still $1 that someone's willing to invest in us. So I'm willing to invest back in that person and show that that dollar was well invested,
For sure.
as a collective. So anyway, I will stop.
No, I love that. It's kind of you're baking a cake that knows what it is, and it's a delicious, dependable. It's like a really good carrot cake. It's like
Yeah,
it's not
right.
the
It's just old
fanciest. It's not
school.
the fanciest cake in the bake sale. It doesn't need to be. It just needs to be there for 3:30 in the afternoon when you're hitting a bit of a low and you need something reliable that is there. That's classic and delicious, and
Exactly.
it's
That's
and it's
I'm
achievable.
going to
It's
use that.
achievable.
It's achievable, and it's consistently good.
Exactly.
Consistently good.
Consistently
Don't
hits the
have to
spot.
question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that next time.
Feel free, please do. Um, so I'm interested in, you've said a few times, or you've mentioned sort of standing up for the trail, and you've referenced sort of threats to the trail, and I'm interested in, what is the work? Where does the focus lie in terms of defending the environment? Is it sort of a specific on the ground thing, or is it on a broader scale in terms of the environmental effects of climate change and the impacts on the watershed? And are there particular practical things that people can do or should be thinking about?
There's definitely both very localized things and then these very existential sort of world issues that are
Mm,
affecting the trail. So for sure, climate change, both things that we're doing along the divide and things that happen outside of the divide that are affecting everything from water usage to, temperatures to, again, like, here in New Mexico, where I should have mentioned I'm in Santa Fe on the homelands of the Tiwa and Hickory Apache people, but the national forests are closed because of the potential for fire danger. And we've had these very extreme events in the Gila National Forest and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness, which is on fire right now, quickly becoming the largest fire in New Mexico history. We just got word they flew over the section of the CDT that got burned, and they described it as a moonscape,
mm,
like absolutely destroyed. So that means not even just the tree, there's no standing live trees, but that means critters
mm,
died. And that means
mhm,
watersheds are now exposed to extreme heat that have Gila trout in them and all these other things. So, yes, those are incredibly important threats. And how do we address them on a global scale? There's so many ways people can do everything from, you know, like I don't have any AC in my house. I put buckets in my shower. So I collect all the water that doesn't go down the drain and put it outside in my garden. So I'm not water, you know what I mean?
mhm,
All those kinds of
mhm,
things that we can all do to conserve and manage ourselves better. But, um, but that's a threat for sure, because it will change the experience. While yes, it tells a story, it tells a different story than maybe we had hoped for people to experience when they're in those sections of the CDT. But I think the big things are that we have a more direct impact on, or ability to influence, or things like just completing the trail. The CDT, unlike many other trails, is not complete yet. We still have 5% to go that are on private lands, and those private lands currently aren't being developed, but they could be. And so the potential to lose really critical connective landscape pieces that connect larger stretches of public lands or federally owned lands is definitely a threat that is our most important focus. And we've heard that from our stakeholders and the people we serve, that completing the trail is critical. We've also heard that these large extreme fire events is critically important to especially local communities. So how do we educate users and recreationists to not have them be the source of a
mm,
fire in those
mm,
places is critical, because that also then says to somewhere where we haven't completed the trail, well, you guys, where the trail was completed, your hikers started a fire, so why should we let you complete the trail near our I mean, they all feed upon each other as much as everything else.
for
But
sure.
I think trail completion is critical, because land use, we're not growing more land, and land becomes more expensive. Developments by obviously extractive things like oil and gas to even renewables. Like there are sections of the CDT down in southern New Mexico that, because the CDT runs north to south and a lot of our energy corridors in the United States run east to west, certain communities are being impacted more than other communities because they're where the energy corridors are. So now all these energy companies, both in the case of oil and gas as much as renewables like solar and wind, are all focusing on the same landscapes. Well, right now those landscapes are relatively undeveloped. They're ranching landscapes and they have huge expanses. But what will change when, there's 500 wind towers in that landscape?
Mm,
It'll alter it immensely. And so there's some equity issues where these communities are bearing the brunt of everybody's energy use. And while yes, they're renewable, and that's really important, doing it smartly so that it minimizes as much as possible the impact. Or like if Boulder wants more, no offense to Boulder, Colorado, but like if Boulder, Colorado wants more solar energy, put the solar panels in Boulder. Why do they have to be up in Lordsburg, New Mexico instead? Like really localize that impact, so it's more, it's easy to think, well, I can keep using energy as much as I want because I don't see it, but it still has to be generated, and it still has to be captured. And even with renewables, you need power lines and transmission lines and roads and lights and gates and fences and all these things that come with it. It's not just a solar panel, it's not just a wind tower, It's all this other infrastructure. And so that's a threat to the CDT right now, is these immense developments that are being proposed because we need the energy, but they're being all located in the same locations that currently right now are relatively undeveloped. And so that intimate experience is going to be altered, but not in a good way. Not in a fire where you can explain it with natural, like you can explain it naturally. It's this whole other human demanded way. I think other things are just like, that we have trails, volunteers, we live in a very rural community based system where, aside from Denver and maybe Salt Lake, and Salt Lake would be on the west side, Denver on the east side of the divide, there aren't a lot of really major population centers for folks to go out and volunteer on these trail segments. And so, again, that puts a burden on local communities who love the CDT, want to steward the CDT, but that's a lot to ask for small communities that already have other major impacts that they have to provide, even though they're surrounded by national forests. They don't get a huge tax base, and then they're like, you want us to steward the trail too? Are you crazy? And they do. But, thinking about how to find, expand stewardship resources, volunteers in particular, to support and augment the folks who live along the trail so that, everybody's sharing in that, I think, is a big part of it. And then, like other things with climate change, just recognizing that these places of national significance are threatened by things, again, that are existential or external to the work that we do. We don't have much control of them, except for individually what we do at home. And so, land development in all its ways is critical. I think that's what keeps me up at night is, we're on borrowed time. We have the Continental Divide Trail Completion Act, which is a piece of legislation Congressman Joe Neguse out of Colorado it's come out of committee. It still needs a vote on the House floor. We're hoping for a vote on the Senate side of U.S. Congress sometime this year, to just sort of keep pressure on the federal agencies to continue to work at completing the CDT through, again, agencies constantly their budgets are decreasing. So these amazingly talented professionals are constantly having more to do with less resources. So then you throw out this whole like, hey, and finish the trail while you're at it. It's impossible for them to do them all well. Like, they just can't. And so this piece of legislation would give them some additional resources to have the capacity to stay consistently working on some of these issues with us so that we get these across the finish line before these places are developed or lost in other kinds of activities. So I think that's our biggest threat. We have some tools in play to address them. So I would say, in terms of people speaking up and standing up, it'd be, even if you live in Tennessee or you live in Maine or you live in Arkansas or you live in Seattle, Washington, calling your representatives and saying, hey, support this piece of legislation, or better yet, support the trail in my local county, my local state, my community, my region, so that I have a place to recreate in and we don't lose it, because it's important to me. Like, that's the most important thing people can do right now, is keep the pressure on, even if it doesn't seem like Congress is doing things. They're listening. They're always listening, and trails are bipartisan and serve so many different assets of our society. Like I said, personal health, mental health, physical health, economic health, as important connectors of neighbors, friends, family, communities, creating just access to nature in general. And if people can just speak up and stand up on behalf of trails with their elected officials at every level, that would go so far in addressing some of these things.
It strikes me, even on the very sort of basic personal or individual rather than personal level, the idea of 100 $101 coins and having 100 people out there sort of wagging their finger at someone smoking a cigarette in the wrong place at the wrong time, or whatever it might be, not to underestimate the impact that you can have on an individual level at the right place and the right time.
Well, I have a great example. I mean, the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, we're 10 years old, and we formed because a previous organization called the Continental Divide Trail Alliance closed its doors. And it closed its doors because it was not managed well as a nonprofit. And not because of anybody on staff. It was really a board oversight thing where just they didn't manage it well. And it's a story of many nonprofits. But when it closed, myself and 3 other folks who had worked previously at CDTA, we were like, oh crap, like if we don't do it, maybe the wrong people will. So we were like if you'd asked me 10 years and 1 day ago, would you ever start a nonprofit or want to be an executive director? I would tell you, no way in hell, ever. Would I ever want to do either one of those things? And here I am 10 years later, like never in my life list of things I ever wanted to do was be an executive director or create a nonprofit. Never, 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 never. And here we are. And it happened because I'd spent at that time like 25 years working, and I had spent 20 years working on the Appalachian Trail and then 5 years at that time at the Continental Divide Trail Alliance as a director of trail operations. And when CDTA closed, myself and 11 other people lost our jobs. And we lost our jobs because people lost sight of the mission, and it became a very corporate approach to people doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons with no oversight. And so those of us who really did care, we were the brunt of that. And my brother, the last day of CDTA was open. It was a very rough night. I remember it was like midnight, and I was in my room, and I was a wreck. And I remember I called my brother, and I was like, I'm not doing well. And he's like, look, first of all, this wasn't your fault. This was their fault. So don't you dare take the blame for something you had nothing to do with. And then he was like, and 2, take a deep breath, and everything will work itself out, I promise. And now that you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to gain. And so I sat with that for a long time, for a couple months, and myself and our other 3 co-founders, we all realized we had to do this together. If we didn't do it together and as a community of 4 people coming together as one, then it was never going to work again. And during that time, we had heard that there were people in the Washington office of a certain federal agency saying, well, if CDTA closed, it must not be in the public's best interest to protect this trail. And I remember when I heard that, I was like, oh no, no. That is not what happened. This was not about the people who love this trail or love this organization or love this landscape. This was about people doing the wrong thing in leadership. And that's when I was just like, pardon my French, I was like, oh shit, we're going to have to do this. And then a colleague of mine said, if you don't do this, the wrong people will. And it was like, shoot, we're going to have to do this. And so we formed pretty much really soon after that. And that was one of our principal foundings, was that we would demonstrate to those federal agency folks, this was in the public's best interest to protect this trail, because by God, it was not because we didn't care. It was because other people didn't care about us. And I think that fundamental value has been critical and core to CDTC ever since, because we will never let this fall on our watch, because it's a we. It's not an ego-driven thing. We are not empire builders. We are in this in service to the trail and to the people and the communities that love this landscape, that understand the importance of it, and the benefit that Congress put a trail along its spine that allows us to protect this landscape is like a bonus. But this is about the humanity of people who are connected to this trail in this landscape. And so, yes, those $1, 100 people, I am more interested in their voices than I am in that dollar bill. And I'm interested in the people who just give me a zip code. Like, they don't even have to give me a buck or give us a buck. I would love, I would love just their zip code. That would be valuable beyond all ends, because it says that they're, I want everyone to know that they have a place at CDTC and that their voice matters in this landscape, because it connects us all. It connects us all, whether they're US citizens or from other countries or whatever. This is a landscape that affects us all. And so, yeah, I mean, that is CDTC's origin, that we were challenged, that a federal agency person said, well, it must not be in the public's best interest to protect this trail. And it was like, oh, no, I think if anything else, it was a big middle finger to them. Like, oh, no, you didn't just say that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, watch this.
We'll show you the public's best interest. Yeah.
We'll show yeah, well, and it's funny because we then decided very fundamentally we would not take a large major donation, and we would not take federal money until we had launched based off of grassroots. So we actually used an Indiegogo campaign called Finding Our Way on the Continental Divide. to launch CDTC. So in fact, I think the first year or two, I did everything voluntarily. I was working 3 jobs. I was like a swim coach. I was a lifeguard. I was working in a bakery. A friend of mine took pity on me and let me work in their bakery. Um, and then I slowly weaned off all those 3 jobs as we got funding into CDTC. And then I was the first part-time employee, but I wasn't the first full-time employee. That was our field programs person. But we formed with this idea that however long it took, we would be based in grassroots support first and foremost, so that was always our foundation, and we would never lose sight of that foundation. And it's worked. And the only reason CDTC is successful now and why the Forest Service elevates us as its #1 shared stewardship partner is because they don't have to pay for it, really. Because we do all the work. We are, when we look at our end of the years, we are 20-1 in match to federal dollars, the amount of money we leverage with volunteer hours and our actual cash. And when I say that to people, it's a powerful thing for me to say, because this is important to the American public. It's so important. We outmatch you 20-1. That's how important this is. And look at all the things that we're doing, and look at all the people that are showing up, and look at the people who are willing to put their voice behind this work in support of this amazing landscape. You can't quiet us now. We've gained our voice. We understand our voice, and we're going to leverage that voice, and we're adding to that voice every day. And what's really powerful is that, even mentioning Connor Ryan, we are looking at how do we now bring in who should have always been in this conversation, Indigenous communities, Native voices, and really start to decolonize. We always admit, first and foremost, we are on stolen lands in this whole landscape. And we need to understand and create space for co-stewardship, even if that means that CDTC is less important and other things are more important, that we need to figure out how to decolonize this work so that it is really done in a way in partnership with Native tribes and Native peoples in a way that maybe hasn't been seen before, because, we'd rather have, again, it goes back to who we need to serve and how we need to serve people. So, yeah, more to come on that, but
yeah. So I actually have a question in relation to that, which is, I would think that one of the strengths of a grassroots support, an organization that's based on the buy-in of a broad range of people, in this instance, would be that there are so many people from both sides of the glaring political divide that have a fundamental appreciation for the outdoors. There's so many people, you could almost draw a stereotype of a far right and a far left. Maybe one would be a hunter and the other would be a bearded ultra runner or something like that, and they might, whatever their political beliefs, they might have mutual buy-in to the importance of protecting the landscape and their recreation, their ability to do what they love in that space. How much do political concerns weigh into? Yeah, how much political calculation do you have to do? None.
None. One, because there's no point in it. And two, especially in the West, this is what a lot of people don't understand about the American West. Most of the communities the trail goes through are surrounded by public lands or federally managed lands, federally administered lands of some sort. And so they already understand the importance for all the reasons: economic, health, access. One of the first Land and Water Conservation Fund acquisition for the Continental Divide Trail was conducted in 2016. It was a BLM purchase in central New Mexico. The conservation buyer was actually the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, who bought the $2.6 million tract that then they held it until the BLM could get the funds from the U.S. government, and then they did the acquisition that way. And it was because the Continental Divide in that location, in the Alamosita Creek location, had no public access for the public. But by buying this acquisition, all of a sudden hunters, turkey hunters, elk hunters had all of a sudden all this access to these places that they traditionally had not had.
Hmm.
So yes, it's not just for hikers.
Yeah.
It's not just for people going end to end. It's for all the values, every kind of value, whether it's cultural significance, hunting, fishing, just general connection to nature.
Mm.
That it goes across the political spectrum, and there's no point in using it in any other way than this is important to the fabric of the American West, and it just transcends that. And so we will find supporters. We've also find supporters who don't want the trail, and that's not even supporters. We find people who say, like, no, I'd rather you not put the trail here. But even in rural communities where there's what's happening in the American West has already happened on the East and West Coast in the United States, in that people, it's expensive to own land, it's expensive to ranch. It's not necessarily because of all the reasons: climate change, lack of water. It's not easy to ranch and grow cattle anymore. And so people who for generations have had a particular way of life are seeing their children leave their communities and go elsewhere. And those children want to stay home, but there's no resources for them. So when they can see even that there's a potential benefit economically for small business development in their communities to stay where they are and have a viable life, they're not going to make a killing, but they're going to make a living, which is far more important. That they can sustain a family that's thriving, and that the family has options and opportunities. That also gets buy-in across the spectrum. And we work with a lot of small business owners in our gateway communities, and we do a small business survey every other year. And this last one was conducted last year, and something like 86% of the small business owners, it was like over 175 people who responded, said that protecting the Continental Divide Trail was important to their community. Completing the Continental Divide Trail was important to their community. So across the board, and it's not just lodging and beer joints. It's like not car dealerships, but like auto mechanic places and other kinds of things that aren't your traditional businesses you might think are associated with recreation in the outdoors. So if across the board you're seeing people understand the importance of things like the Continental Divide Trail for all the various benefits, you don't have to make the political case, because it's made for itself. Because again, we all have this deep connection to this landscape. We have a deep connection to the rural Rocky Mountain West, and people don't want to see it change, but they also don't want to see it also die. So there's a way to balance the thriving with things like the Continental Divide Trail or other kinds of outdoor recreation resources that allow investment of local communities, both in themselves, in businesses, and allow a sustainable economy to be developed. It won't, it's not just about the CDT, it's about all the suite of assets that, community has. Like someone could come in and hike the CDT in Rollins, Wyoming one day, go fly fishing the next day, and go ATVing the third day. But that's 3 nights potentially spent in a hotel, experiencing everything about the Great Divide Basin. And so that's success. So it celebrates all the different things that a community has in all the different ways. It's not just about the CDT. And so I think that's, when we talked earlier about like how we see all these connections of the trail, again, it's not just that one type of user or that one type of experience. It's how the CDT can serve all of these different places naturally, without over promotion or commodifying it, in a way that really allows communities along this landscape to thrive and to find new opportunities to survive, and combat against things like oil and gas development as the only alternative for making money and keeping their lands. Maybe recreation could help do it too, and so it opens up a whole different set of conversations and opportunities that maybe people haven't thought about. And I think it helps. We've always had the congressional decision makers along the Continental Divide from both sides of the aisle have always been in support of protecting it. I mean, it's not, they get it. And some of our staunchest supporters have been not people you would expect. They were on one particular side of the spectrum, and you'd be like, wow, that's our fiercest supporter, is not maybe on paper who you think it might be. And so I think that speaks volumes about the value that people see in outdoor recreation in the West and along the divide. Is actually, instead of a divide, it's actually where we come together. We find unity in this really crazy way. kind of kind of irony.
Hmm. Beautiful. I love that.
I remember the first time I was on the divide when I was like, I don't even remember how old I was, maybe 18 or 19 or 20. And I just remember like, wow, this is where the water begins.
Mm,
And then you think about this journey that all of it takes. And so whether you're in Canada or you're down here or you're in Mexico or the South America or in the Arctic, for example, it's still profound that that's where the water begins. That's where
mm,
life begins,
mm,
you know, and
for sure.
it's kind of cool that you can put your
Yeah.
feet right where that happens, that
Very
you can
cool.
intimately have that experience. Yeah.
Yeah. No doubt. Well, yeah, thanks so much. Fantastic, huge congratulations from me personally and from Saul on 10 years, and on the amazing work that you folks are doing, and on your resilience and positivity and energy. Um, yeah, I think it's quite fantastic.
Well,
And
thank
I'm
you.
very, yeah, thank you for your time. I'm very glad to have had the chance to chat. Is there anything else that you would like to say finally? Any final points?
I just hope everybody that listens, you know, if they haven't had a chance to step foot on the Continental Divide, you know, I hope someday you do, but also just go put your feet on a trail in
Mm,
your own backyard or your front
mm,
yard or make your own trail and get connected to nature in a way that gives you a sense of wonder and exploration and gets you outside and do it with a friend or family or a neighbor and share the experience because we need that more than anything else is to get connected with one another and to take care of one another in these really difficult times.
for sure. Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Teresa.
You're welcome.